very quick, because there was two sort of direct economics questions, parts of which Stathis has dealt with. First one about capital controls, which is just a general point here. I mean, sort of bang on about the German government and Schäuble and that sort of thing. If there's a real villain in all of this, it has been the European Central Bank, which is now, this is 3 times it's done this since the crisis broke out. 3 times. This is a central bank. Right? A central bank is there to look after the banking system. That carries with it all sorts of problems. It's there to look after banks. It is not there to try and collapse a banking system. And it did this in 2010 in Ireland. It did it again in 2013. It's done it very clearly in 2015 in Greece. That you have a central bank which is there to guard the banking system. That's basically what a central bank is supposed to do. There is a whole load of other nonsense about it being politically independent and all the stuff that they taught me down the road at LSE and that sort of thing. So it's meant to be politically independent. In fact, it's nakedly political, and it's intervening in defence of creditors inside the European Union by threatening to collapse Greece's bank system, which is insolvent by any measure. It's utterly dependent on funding from external sources, which, if you're in the euro, has to come from the European Central Bank ultimately. So it's completely dependent and therefore totally vulnerable. Exactly the same thing in Cyprus, exactly the same thing in Ireland. Now, this is quite an extraordinary thing. It's meant to protect the banking system. It intervenes directly. No one elected Mario Draghi, by the way. Whatever you want to say about Schäuble, he did win an election at some point. In fact, he's won several, right? Nobody voted for Draghi. Nobody voted for the European Central Bank. There could not be a more graphic example of the clash between democracy on one side and, frankly, bankers on the other. Right? This is precisely what's just taken place here. But one of the more subtle ways I think they tried to collapse the Greek banking system, it wasn't just the removal of the Eurosystem support, which was changing the conditions for collateral that you need to get the support out of the system. It was the kind of whispers that, oh, maybe the European Central Bank would want to impose capital controls. Right, now, look, this is a bit like Fight Club. The first rule of Capital Control Club is you don't talk about Capital Control Club. You just have to do it straight away and surprise everyone, because if you don't do it straight away and surprise everyone, anybody who has any cash and has an inclination to get it out of the country, so it's all of your rich, will do precisely that. So the merest hint that you might try and stop people moving money out of the country, everybody with money tries to move it out of the country. So you saw over the last week extraordinary sums leaving, €1.5 billion a day, exiting out of the Greek banking system, which was already, as I said, insolvent. A deliberate intervention by the ECB. Now, if nothing else, I don't think it's not plausible to say let's democratise a thing. You just have to break it up. That's why you talk about breaking the euro, which, to get onto Lizzie's question, was how do you actually fund all of this if you carry out the plan B? Well, it costs us him again. His last book does have a good, detailed, like, this is what you would do for Plan B. And it kind of looks like this. The first one is, once you default on your debt, you don't have to pay for the debt anymore, right? So immediately you free up, well, for this year, about €24 billion. Immediately. By the way, the entire emergency programme, if memory serves, is about €12 billion. Yeah. So, you immediately free up 24 billion that you don't have to pay. That's straight away money you now have. Right, that's the first bit. This is the big dirty secret of default, by the way. There's only about 6 countries in the world that have never defaulted. Never defaulted. We're one of them. Germany really isn't. Right, it's a very persistent defaulter if you look back over it. And most countries that default, after about a year or two of things being pretty hectic and pretty chaotic, after about 5 years, they're much, much better off than they were. Argentina being the absolutely classic recent example of this. Now, there are lots of differences between Greece and Argentina, but there's also lots of similarities. So you default, it's like hitting a reset button. You've done that straight away. The second bit is you need to get out of the euro. I think Varoufakis had a proposal to default inside the euro. Forget it. Because what you're doing if you're still inside the euro is you told a load of people you owe money, we're not going to pay you, and they go, OK, we're going to collapse your banking system. So you have to get out of the euro. You have to impose capital controls. If you impose capital controls under any conditions, you're already halfway out. If there's a real problem accessing money straight away, and you can do this as a halfway house, and you can issue things that are a bit like money, scrip, that you can say, if you're the government, we'll give you this token, and you can use it to pay taxes in the future. That's one kind of halfway house. But really, you need to get out. You have to impose capital controls. You have to then, if you have your own money supply, you can, as the government, issue bonds in your own money and say to the banks, this is the capital base that you need to keep operating. You can do that. I think Kostas has touched on the Russian thing. I think it's, to rule this out beforehand is a total mistake. There's an underlying bit here, which is that the entire world economy is not structured around just what the kind of old capitalism, historic capitalism in the West wants anymore. You can see the breakup happening. You can see the shift in the lines of power and relationships there. Well, make use of that. Russia would fall over itself to give you a soft loan, because they want an in on the European Union, and more, other details there, that they also want some way to get the gas out of Russia through a second stream into the European Union as well, currently blocked by the EU for entirely sort of geopolitical reasons. So there's plenty of other sources to go for there. That is what a plan on exit looks like. It has to also be combined to deal with the economic dislocation, with things like subsidising food, not food tokens, subsidising food, subsidising wages, a transfer of money from poor to rich, and of course on top of that, some sort of industrial programme to deliver investment in bits of the economy where jobs need to be done. This is the role of Germany, I think, is quite central to the thing. In the case of Ukraine, I think what they had last year was far too much pushing at something, which then spiralled out of control. They thought they had a compromised government. They ended up with that compromised government collapsing and this sort of coalition of neoliberals and fascists taking over, with the consequences that are set in train there. I don't view the German ruling class as particularly keen on the situation. I think they want to try and manage it, and that if you're dealing with a world in which you have both a kind of quite close crisis, which is Greece, and then another one that's also geographically not that far away, which is Ukraine, you want to deal with both of these things. Hence the panic a few weeks ago with Merkel trooping off and trying to get a peace deal, which lo and behold has duly collapsed. So that's how the thing starts to fit in. I think this is a general pattern of the core of the system since 2008 looks increasingly like it can't get itself out of the various messes that it's got into. That there is a crisis, a malaise that is ongoing, that is a very sharp form in Greece, and even more sharp form in Ukraine, and there is very little that the existing institutions seem to be able to do about it, because in practice they're completely tied up with very particular sets of interests. When push comes to shove, you can understand the entirety of the Eurozone crisis by the need of major European powers to protect their banks at all costs, and then as an incidental, maybe you'll just trash someone else's. That's what it comes down to. That's what the bailouts meant. People have seen the figures from Jubilee Debt Campaign, bothered to do the calculations. It's incredible. About 90% of the money that went to the Greek government went straight back to Greece's creditors. This is not a bailout of Greece. This is a bailout of Greece's creditors, which are large European banks in the first instance, and now it's transferred over to being large European states in the second instance. So that's how you understand the crisis. And because it's all tangled up like this, they can't possibly impose a solution that actually works for anyone. Now, the naivety, I think you have to call it in some senses, the Syriza leadership was to believe you can just sort of walk through this and everyone's going to be nice and fine and dandy. Not going to happen. Very obviously not going to happen. The actions of the ECB alone should be enough to tell us that the European institutions aren't going to budge. What do you do if you actually default? Well, it is difficult. But there is a distinction here, I think, between a kind of creditor-led default that is imposed on you. Greece has already had this, effectively, a write-off back in 2012. Private sector involvement that basically just shift the debt from being in private institutions effectively into public. So it's already had that, but it came attached, because this was a deal. Oh, we're going to get rid of some of your debt, but you have to do even more austerity because we're so nice, right? That's how the thing plays out. What you want is a debtor-led default where you impose the conditions. Because you potentially, well, you know the joke. Oh, a bank £1,000, that's your problem. Oh, a bank £1 million, that's a bank's problem. Well, it's a problem for the banks. It's a problem for your creditors. So you have some leverage in those situations. You have none whatsoever if you walk into negotiations with your creditors and say, oh, we're not going to do that. Don't worry, we're all friends here. All right, that's gone already. You have to have, as people have pointed out, the plan B. If you do it, the general pattern of these things for the last 10, 15, 20 years has been a period of maybe 1 or 2 years of a shake-up, particularly where the default has been forced on you, as in Argentina. Effectively, the thing just collapses. But much more if you get control of the process, as in Ecuador. Right? So you have negotiation with your creditors and you get somewhere reasonable out of that. The specific difficulties in this are that, first of all, capital markets are surprisingly forgiving about default. They're there to make money. They like government debt, full stop. All right, it's risky government debt, but someone can make money out of risky government debt. So you can get back into capital markets surprisingly rapidly in a number of cases. Argentina has particular features where they didn't. You can guarantee trade as government. If you need trade credits, which might be an issue if you default, then you can say, we as the government will guarantee this loan. And of course, as has been pointed out, there are other sources outside of Western financial institutions now, in a serious way, that there wouldn't have been 10 or 15 years ago. And the entire process, I think, probably since the East Asian crisis at the end of the 1990s, has been this emergence of alternative financial centres. Why not turn to some of those? So that's what you do. What do we do here? Well, look, it depends what the lessons are from Syriza. One of them could be, oh my God, don't bother, right? And that's probably the wrong lesson if anybody's thinking about that at this point. That is not where we are at. Where I think we are at is, first, this is a marker. right? It's a marker, and it's good that we even have a discussion about what you might do if you have a government that's supposed to be committed to austerity but it's being battered by everyone. That is better than having discussion where you're facing a government that is committed to austerity and will impose austerity and you're getting battered by it. It's a much better discussion to have. It makes a marker. The number of people who felt that kind of hope and inspiration out of what Syriza was and what it had done, I think, is important. So the question here for us is that, okay, we suffer austerity, not to the same extent as Greece, but we suffer it. We actually have far more room for manoeuvre because we're not in the euro. We actually do have these things. How do we get to a point where we end austerity? None of the main parties, none of them are saying they will end austerity, right? You either get more or less of it. You either get your head boiled quickly or you get it boiled slowly. That's kind of the choices that you're faced with at this point in time. There has to be the question raised of how do you create a viable anti-austerity party out of this election? I think it's going to be a mess all round. I think the only real winners are going to be the Scottish National Party, who, by the way, are actually opposed to austerity. There's something in this. Once we get through that, then I think the path forward will be clearer. But it has to come down to something like, we cannot carry on with a political system where the only credible options are how much unpleasantness do you want? What colour bread do you want in your shit sandwiches? Is not really an option that we ought to be taking out of this. So we have to build something new out of that, and that, I think, is the lesson to take from Syriza. You can oppose this. They have made a marker, but that's just the first step. You need a left. You need a radical left as part of that operation of building a broader campaign, a broader party against austerity.